it's a little bit simpler. So we've got in the vertex part of the shading process. We have our sway with the wind for the leaf, and we have that kind of silhouetting effect I talked about, and the flat shading, this kind of cartoon flat shading. These are happening in the fragment phase. So the swaying motion of the vertexes, we're taking world position and object space. We're using the vertical component of object space, feeding that in as the height to this subshader that I've written. We're taking the lateral position only, not the elevation, so X and Z of its world position as our feeding our sampling point of the texture. We're providing our texture. We're telling it what scale the texture should be scaled to, and affect a multiplier of time to how quickly we move through that texture. So effectively a starting point, how quickly we're going to move through the texture and the size of the texture. This then samples, that subsampler just samples that texture, and then provides out from that, having sampled the RG and B and worked out the bearing angle as a vector, it returns a two-dimensional vector. There's no elevation, and this little routine here, this subgraph, is about taking the two-dimensional wind magnitude vector from here and saying, well, okay, if the grass is to be blown a certain amount in a certain direction, you can't stretch the grass blade, you can only bend it. Therefore, if you move it laterally a certain amount, well, then it has to come down in height. Otherwise, you'd be stretching and elongating the length of the grass blade. And the same is true for a leaf or anything else that's moving. And this is my my routine for working out, given a lateral wind strength, how much of that will actually be in a lateral direction and how much of that will be moved into the vertical component to bend the frond downwards. And that partly depends on how long the frond is, so that's why these are the three things going in. That works that out then as a three-dimensional vector that the frond should be, frond vertex should be displaced by, and that movement is added onto the frond's starting position. And because that was all in world space, and the vertex master node wants it in object space, we transform from world to object to keep it happy, and that's the principle there. The palm shade is similar, but it has the complexity of the which we can talk about in a minute. Flat shading is being done by taking the by rotating all the normals of the object being shaded. All the fragments of the object need to spin round to be angled at halfway between the sun or the light source and the camera direction. You want it to be halfway because that will give you the best angle in terms of the light bouncing and seeing it. It's the midpoint between camera and light source, so that gives you your best angle. But the reason it gives you a flat shading is essentially you've turned every fragment, every piece of the geometry, regardless of where it is in the mesh, you've turned it to face the same, you've turned every face to point in the same direction, and therefore it has an even shading across it as a result. So that's what that's doing, getting the vector from the camera to the tree, getting the light direction, which we're feeding in through C#. There's a script running that updates any materials that need the light direction like this. That updates every frame. So we actually need the opposite of the light direction vector being fed in there. Because these will be in different lengths, but we're not interested in their lengths, we're just interested in the directions, because we want to take the midpoint between them. I am normalizing them. Possibly I don't need to do that. I need to think about that after the video, in case actually when you dot product them it doesn't make any difference. No, it will do. It has to make a difference, because the dot product is a projection of one vector onto another, and therefore the length of those vectors is totally important. So yes, I do need to normalize it, otherwise we'll get numbers that are not between 0 and 1. Normalizing means that our results are always going to range between -1 and 1. So I want to remap those to be used as something that we can multiply the color of the tree canopy by. -1 means we're behind the tree, and therefore the sun is shining straight into our eyes, and there's no triangle formed between us, the tree, and the sun. 1 means we're at the same position as the sun's looking over our shoulder, again no triangle. Anywhere else between it means we're forming a triangle between sun, tree and camera, and we want to remap that to 0 to 1 so that we can say when we're with the sun, if we're in the same place as the sun shining over our shoulder, the tree should look its full colour. If we're directly behind the tree, it should be dark, and anywhere in between is just a sort of a lerp between them. And so that gives us values 0 to 1, and then I'm just exacerbating it, or exaggerating it by power of 3 to get a more sudden transition to silhouetting as you approach the sun angle. So that's what that is. That's my routine. Palm tree is similar main root motion of the tree, and so this, bear in mind, this is a vertex on the palm leaf. So how can it know about the tree? The way we do that is by saying in the object space, our origin has been carefully positioned when I was making the fronds, by carefully positioning in the x-axis at the distance of the height of the tree trunk, and therefore I've got that stored in my R value. Then that's coming being used to feed into the height. I can calculate as if this was the height of the tree trunk, and that's job done for this bit. Then I want to add my leaf motion. So this is the bit that is about the vertex of the leaf. So the actual channel B is in Blender. Z and Y are switched round. So this Unity, it would normally be the second parameter, but in Blender it's the third parameter. It's a bit of a nuisance. So this actually is the height or length of the frond, so this is now, I'm exacerbating it by a power of 2, so that as the frond gets longer, the movement is squared. That's being fed in, same algorithm, getting a displacement for the frond leaf. So that's the crucial difference there, is which value is being fed in from object space. And then in addition to that, I want to have some tip flutter, random tip flutter. The tops of each triangle leaf should be the tips. So I just have time, and the starting position. So here's my XZ world space position, is my seed value for where I'm going to sample my gradient noise or purlin noise, and time. So as the game progresses, it moves through the purlin noise map to get a value between 0 and 1. I'm remapping that to something of a scale that I just have empirically tried and found gives a nice flutter. I'm using the normal vector for the vertex and as my fluttering direction, so multiplying it by that magnitude, and I'm adding that on to the what came out the wind map. So that's been added, my tip flutter's been added. Now I don't want I only want the tips of the fronds to flutter. I don't want the base where it's connected to the tree, or otherwise that's going to look weird. It's going to detach from the tree randomly, and we don't want that, especially on something like this. It needs to stay attached. So only the tips. And so we only add this flutter if this branch predicate is true, and then we add it. If it's not true, then we're not going to add this on at all. We're just going to keep with what came out of the noise map, the wind map, with no flutter, so that we don't sort of randomly detach with fluttering noise. So how do we know if it's the tip of the frond? Well, when I was designing these trees, I made sure that the fronds were triangles, and that means I know that because I designed it in Blender, I made sure that the tip of each frond is the third vertex, or a multiple of 3. And so I can say, get the idea of the vertex, use the modulus, i.e. divide it by 3, and provided that gives you a remainder of 1, in my case that identified that it was the tip. It could be 0, 1 or 2, because there's three points in every triangle. And that's the one for me that worked, given the way I modelled it in Blender. So that's how I do my shader, adding all those 3 things together, adding the root motion, the frond wind motion, and the tip flutter, and then transforming all those world movements back into object space to move the vertex, and that's it. So took a bit of thought, that one, but pretty pleased with the results. So that's all of those, and this has been a long video, but I've put a lot of work into that, and I wanted to keep a record. That's what these videos are really for. I don't think anyone else is gonna watch them. They're just a diary for me. Was there anything else I wanted to remember about this? So we've got the movements of the shaders. We've got the colorization of it. I think that's just about everything. Oh, I could maybe Blender. I could just show what I meant about the position in Blender, because it might not have been very clear what was going on about. Let's try that one. That's not the right one. Not having much luck. 14A, 14D. I think these are all exploded. I don't think I saved. I don't think I saved the results. That was an early go. I got the vines to ripple in the wind, and that had the same issue of making sure they had a root motion from the trunk or the branches. This was even more complicated because um, because the movement of the branch was not based on the height only, because I didn't. Oh, this, well, I haven't used this, or I've decided not to use it. The idea was it would look a bit like a spooky man, but it just looked really primitive and rubbish. So this thing here was supposed to be a bit like a head on it, and so I didn't want the stem to wobble just with height, otherwise the head would wobble quite a lot and the rest wouldn't, and the head would be wobbling as much as the sort of the hands at the end of the branch, and it looked a bit daft. So I wanted the wobble with the wind to be more emphasized at the ends here than at the head. So I multiplied the X direction, or the lateral direction out, in X, the absolute X, by Y, sorry, Z in this case, in Blender's terminology, so that if X is effectively 0, where we're in the tree trunk, it nullifies the movement, because you've got 0 times something. So it doesn't matter how tall it is, you effectively get 0. But as you begin to progress away from the tree trunk, like along these arms, then you've got obviously a decent value in Z, and also a decent value in X progressing out until you get your most maximum effectively at your sort of top right and bottom and top left corners. So that's well and good, but that means to get the root motion of these vines at where they're anchored, to get the motion of the anchor coinciding with the branch and not looking like they're coming off, you have to. So these vertexes, bear in mind when Unity's shading these, any one of these vertexes knows nothing about the tree trunk. So how can you possibly work out what that motion is at this point? The way to do it, or the way I've gone about doing it, is by setting the origin. So you can see the origin of each of these vines I've carefully set to be behind the tree by an amount, and you can see it changes. It's the height, or the how far the origin is behind the model, is actually based on the height of the stem. So that's what I was talking about before in the shader, and then that way it knows its own position in world space to work out how much the wind should be blowing it. And it can also then feed in this effectively its offset. The object space means all its coordinates are relative to this position here. So obviously every vertex along here, relative to that origin, is the height. So the first one here, which you want to stay attached, its value in the Y is in fact the height of the tree. So you can feed in its Y, object space Y, for that coordinate, and you'll get the offset required. And then because this vine, they're all roughly the same distance away, they will have that starting value, which is what you want, and then you add on the object space Z value to increasingly wiggle these vines, so the end here has a much greater Z value compared to, because remember it's relative to that point there. So this one has a relative Z of 0 compared to there in object space. This has in object space a relative Z quite a lot compared to here, and so this can be its Z component can be fed into the algorithm that wiggles the vertex leaf, and its Y component can be fed in for the root motion of the tree. And for the variant where I didn't want the head to move, I then went through and moved the origin, offset it in X as well. So each of these had their X value behind it, and that way I could test its X position and feed X and Y in to get the root motion, and then use the Z value for the additional wiggle of the vine. Yeah, you can take my word for it. I probably didn't explain it very well, but hopefully you get the idea. By moving the origin point, you effectively gain a couple of bits of data about its relative position, which was dead handy, because otherwise I'd be stuck with a C# script that was trying to somehow update the shader individually for each tree in the landscape, and that's simply not possible. You can do it for game objects, but you can't do it for individual trees in the terrain, because they're all using the one shader. So if you update a variable for one, you've updated it for all of them, so you can't get any variation between your trees in terms of if they're all at different heights and positions. It just doesn't work like it does for a game object. Well, that's it for this edition, and I'm going to have to cut this video up because it's going to be so big.